Loving others is the real trip. Psychedelics is a door that opens up between where you're at now and who you really want to be. Between the freedom I felt and the fear that all my other New Yorkers were feeling, I could see that's the power of psychedelics. That distance between us, the healing that took place, that's the power of it.
Welcome to Psychedelic Source, where wisdom meets practice in the evolving landscape of psychedelic medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Sandra Dreisbach, and I'm here to help you navigate the complex intersection of ethics, business, and personal growth in the psychedelic space. Whether you're a practitioner, therapist, entrepreneur, or simply curious about this transformative field, you've found your source for authentic dialogue, practical resources, and community connection. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the stories, strategies, and ethical considerations that matter most to our growing ecosystem. Let's tap in to our inner source of wisdom and explore what it means to build a sustainable and ethical psychedelic future together.
The information shared on this podcast, our website, and other platforms may be triggering for some viewers and readers and is for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical, legal, or therapeutic advice. While we explore topics related to altered states of consciousness, we do not endorse or encourage illegal activities or substance use. Always research your local laws and consult qualified professionals for guidance. The content provided is, as is, and we are not liable for any actions taken based on the information shared. Stay supported and informed, act responsibly, and enjoy the podcast.
In this episode, I talked with Dr. Nicholas Powers. He is a poet, a literature professor, novelist, and journalist. He's the author of 5 books. His literary journalism was collected in The Ground Below Zero, 9/11, to Burning Man, New Orleans to Darfur, Haiti to Occupy Wall Street, and the political vampire novel, Thirst. And in 2025, this year, North Atlantic Books published Black Psychedelic Revolution, which we definitely discuss. And I'm most of the way through it, and I can tell you that it's definitely an enjoyable read and an experience in and of itself. So I highly recommend it. Our first book recommend on our show, but definitely worth checking out. It just released. And so you'll hear us talk about his latest book, talk about his own background and history, and we even get a little bit of poetry at the end. So enjoy the show. Well, welcome so much, Nicholas, to Psychedelic Source. I am so grateful that you could make some time here, and it looks like we may even do this in 2 parts, which I kind of even love the idea of, like that, especially given your book and everything. But I'll let you say a little bit about yourself before I go too far into assuming people know conversations that they aren't a part of.
Sure. I guess I'm like the right wing's worst nightmare. I'm a
Ooh, wow, that's a
professor.
preface.
I'm an English professor of color. I've gone to the BLM marches. I support my trans friends. I love poetry, do activism. I do boxing, jogging, running. I have a father. I live in Brooklyn, which is for, totally, free Palestine, for end the genocide in Gaza. You see that spray painted everywhere. So I'm probably one of the more progressive. I'm a cliche of progressive identity in a cliche zip code in a cliche city. So like it's just so many layers of blue that I look like a Smurf. I am Papa Smurf of the left.
Oh, hello, Papa Smurf. I don't think I'm a Smurfette. I don't know. I have a lot of questions about that whole. Anyway, we won't go there. But I love that you're already kind of telling a story, and you are a professor of literature, right? But you also are a journalist, and the book you just wrote and released is Black Psychedelic Revolution, which I've actually been enjoying. And actually, I have the audiobook version, so like, which is I highly recommend. Not that you shouldn't read like the physical fiction slash history book. But maybe you could tell a little bit about that. Like, how did you come to write that story?
Yeah, it was a fork in the road moment. I was approached by acquisition editors for North Atlantic Books, and this was, um, I think, a little bit before the George Floyd
Mm.
swell wave of protest. And, that had a cultural effect. That wave of protest spilled over not only into the halls of power, but also really into the halls of media and into the halls of our everyday lives. And so I was kind of picked up by that wave. And the acquisition editor asked me, like, hey, to write a book about race and psychedelics. And I, stood at the crossroads and I could write a kind of paint by numbers, Oprah friendly book. And I decided to actually follow my curiosity, but also my love for my son and asking, well, what's the book that could possibly make a world where he and the other kids in the playground have a real chance to live? That a world where psychedelics was at the tool, not only of healing, which it should be, but also of a revolutionary consciousness that is maybe different in how it works than the traditional forms of Western Marxism, of intersectionality, of identity politics, but like it has just like a different engine. And so I began to write that book. And as I was writing it, I pulled threads from my bookshelves, pulled the different books. There was like a stack of books, like next to the
Yeah, I think you
laptop.
mentioned 4 in the book, right?
Yeah,
Including the Michael Pollan book,
the Michael
but also
Pollan book.
W.B. Du Bois, if I recall correctly.
Yep, no, good memory. And but I began to realize that as I was, going to the store and, getting food for the family and just walking and talking. And in New York, if you walk half a block anywhere in any direction, you can have like 10 conversations. And I began to think, well, what's the book that I could write that my neighbors could read? I wanted them to be able to read it. And then when I'm taking my son to school, if we're on the bus, or if I'm bringing him back from the museum, and I'm thinking about the bus driver or the train operators or the MTA workers cleaning out the stations with, foamy suds and thistles. And I think like, well, how can I imagine this book in their backpack? You know? And so I began to write for my son, but I began to write to the city, to the people who I live with, to my neighborhood. And I found that at least for me, for me as a writer, it's easy to have in some ways like the New York Times editorial team in your head, or like the Nobel Prize team in your head, or the MacArthur Genius. Like it's easy to have the faces of liberal awards and accomplishment going, all the way up to the Nobel Prize and the Kennedy Center as the people who I'm supposed to write to, because they're the
Mm.
ones who give a kind of a guarantee of approval. Like
Yeah,
you've
here's
made
your
it.
stamp of approval, you're culturally approved to be
And
distributed and a New York Times bestseller.
yeah, and the thing is when as of someone who not, I teach literature, but I've been a practicing poet. I've been a poet now for about 20 some years, a writer for longer. And what I've always known is that when I write to the people who I actually have a real relationship to, that voice is the one that winds up becoming the most poetic.
Mm.
And it because like as I'm trying to reach to this person who I care about so much, that in the service of that human connection, I will bring in metaphors and similes and allegories. I will bring in themes and motifs. I will bring in primary and secondary characters, and that in different genres, all of them become in service of this connection. And that to me is what I call, I guess, like method writing or kind of authentic writing, because it's a writing in which that's the service of a connection with another person. And so I began to bring in fiction to the Black Psychedelic Revolution, history into the Black Psychedelic Revolution, humor into it, analysis, cultural analysis, introspection, poetry. And on the surface, it may seem kind of like a wild tiramisu cake of different, layers. But the thing that everyone says is that it's such a kind of like an easy read. And I think the reason that it is such an easy read is because that there's an emotional commitment to an authentic connection to the reader, you know? And I think that's why it was important for me to write for my son, but it was definitely important for me to write to the city, to my neighbors, and to my
Yeah.
students. And I think that's how the book actually took shape. It was about me being honest about who am I actually talking to? Oh, that's who I'm talking to. Well, that's what's important.
No, it's beautiful. It really does feel like a love letter, you know. And I and here, at least on Psychedelic Source, I try and ask people questions about their history and their background and how they came into relationship with psychedelics, or even where their cultures or their intersectionalities, all the things. And I love how in your book it's very clear about your own family history and relationship and how that was part of the storytelling as well. It's not just about forward looking or identity shaping or even backwards looking and reconnecting in a fiction plus history. Maybe you'd speak a little bit more about that piece. Like why psychedelics?
Yeah. I inherited the psychedelic vision from my mother, who was born in 1948. So in 1968, she was 20, and she was just this hot, mama from New York, Brooklyn, and she knew it too. She shook that ass and she got into Woodstock and got behind the um backstage and watching the musician goes up and down the stage carrying their amps and smoking with the band and all that. And she loved it. She loved the psychedelic community at Woodstock, that everyone treated each other like family, that people fed her, gave her a place to sleep and stay. And so when she came back from Woodstock, which is in upstate New York, back to Brooklyn, she was, I think, astounded by the world, how many different worlds are on this one planet. Like there in Woodstock was this like utopian, like city on a hill, this new Eden, this Garden of Eden. And then when she came back to New York, it was the clanging of the subways and hustle, and everyone's trying to make that money. And she began to realize that psychedelics was one necessary ingredient to the 1968 uh, social rebellion and anti-war movement and the social movements. So she would tell me those stories as I was young, because like we just had, there was no cell phones back then, so you just had to tell stories to keep the time passing. So as we're doing these long walks, she would just tell me the stories. And I inherited an idea of psychedelics as a kind of liberation of consciousness, as a way of helping one get beyond, the establishment, the consensus, which was what, at that point was pretty clear, warmongering, very patriarchal, white supremacist, very capitalist, very, against the working
Absolutely.
class.
Yeah.
And so when you see all these, for me, psychedelics, then I took them up into my own life. And at first it was just going to raves and
Right.
kind of enjoying the hot soup of sweat and dance and sex and silliness and laughter and all that at the raves. And then coming again, like her, coming back to, at that point I was in Boston for college, coming back to the city and seeing people in their suits and striving for that dollar. And psychedelics at first for me were like what they were for my mom, a tool for liberation. But it was only after I went to Burning Man in 2002, and this had been a year after 9/11. So when I came back to Burning Man, when I went to Burning Man for the first time, and I took LSD and ecstasy, that I really, really felt the healing power of psychedelics and how much that they could help trauma pass through the nervous system, have trauma pass through the different layers of consciousness and finally emerge. And for me, I coughed out 9/11 in the desert. I screamed, I cried, did everything. And so when I come back to the city, my body is like confetti. I'm just glittering and feeling so much more open. But everyone else around me is still holding tight and scared that the next bomb is going to go off or they're going to be in a building and it's going to be struck. So between the freedom I felt and the fear that all my other New Yorkers were feeling, I could see that's the power of psychedelics, that distance between us, the healing that took place, that's the power of it. And since then, psychedelics have been in my life both as healing and as inspiring to higher visions of interconnectedness with other human beings.
And I love this interplay of both where your own personal story begins with psychedelics, where your own journey is, and how that interrelates with collective experiences of trauma, right? And I know you wrote another book on 9/11, and that sort of like this sort of I've seen this pattern at least in the writings that you have about like a traumatic experience and then how that shifts and pivots, right? And Black Psychedelic Revolution, at least in terms of, like my experience with the book so far, I'm only about halfway through. It really captures that same. You mentioned 9/11, but you also mentioned about, like even historical Black comedians talking about their experiences with psychedelics, and then bringing that to the present time, and I kind of you get this feeling not just of whatever kind of gift you're giving to your son, and to the city of Brooklyn and your community, but also a gift in terms of your own healing and transformation and what the meaning making is of all this.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when I looked at Black and Latino, and these are all kind of within the American like 1968, 70s context, that I think what struck me was that psychedelics could inspire utopian visions. Psychedelics could be healing, but psychedelics could also lead to a dead end. And I think what really took me aside was when the comedian Richard Pryor, who passed a couple of years ago, but obviously he's like one of the giants of the art form, um, went to, I think it was Kenya, and he went there and he had, I would say, an incredibly soul moving experience. That he's a Black American guy, so he's only experienced life as a racial minority. And, to be Black in America is, constantly, in a sense, to live under the pressure of history, knowing what your ancestors went through, which usually obviously was worse. And to have that experience of your ancestors inform you and educate you about why what was happening to you now was happening, right? Like why the policemen were stopping you, why you were having a hard time at work, why you weren't really prepared the way you should have been prepared, why people were being suspicious of you, like all of that, the weight, the constant heaviness. And so when he went to Kenya, and all of that briefly, beautifully disappeared. It's like the weight was lifted off his shoulders. He felt, and he realized he would see people in Kenya that reminded him of people in Illinois, where he was raised, and other
In
places. He
Peoria,
and
yeah.
in Peoria, and he would say, "Oh my God, like the drunk in my town looks exactly like this diplomat. He should have been that diplomat, right?" So he had a much more transforming experience in Kenya, seeing Black people in positions of power, seeing Black people in control of the nation, control of their own land, not having all the symptoms of internalized racism, like, but really having liberated themselves. He got a much more powerful trip through that than he did actually through LSD. And so for me, what was powerful is that it's not LSD alone. It's LSD plus the set and setting and container of a revolutionary model. Like, what experience can you have on psychedelics that actually helps you free yourself from the different internalized power dynamics that have gone into your body, as much as air and water and Kool-Aid and hamburgers and hot dogs and the God, Lord's Prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance, like all of that that's been going through your body since you were a kid, you know? And that to me is one of the promises of psychedelics, not just as personal therapy, but as, I would say, revolutionary ignition, to help people ignite, the revolutionary within them, and to open their minds to. And this is where I say this is probably the last thing because of time. But what I found was that most most forms of Western Marxism and Marxism, Soviet Marxism, have at its core that there has to be a militant, violent class struggle, and that the workers have to come to a sense of self-consciousness and
Right,
become the
and revolt.
proletariat
Yeah.
and revolt, and that at some point they must kill or liquidate the bourgeoisie as a class, which is a kind of euphemism for mass murder. And that's a revolutionary war. It's a class war. Like, they've been killed for many years by the bourgeoisie. Now it's time to fight back. And so it's seen as justified revolutionary violence. But what psychedelics often, at least in my experience, do is that they show how flimsy this ego is, how much of a illusion this sense of myself, I am, and what the truth is, how deeply connected I am with other people. And so one of the things that I think a psychedelic revolution differs in dramatic concept and quality from the Western Marxism is that at least it holds open the possibility that if people entered into the psychedelic sphere, entered into the psychedelic state, that in that place they could see how interconnected they are, And maybe, just maybe, that the revolution could happen through love, empathy, and awareness rather than through, rampaging through the suburbs or the wealthy zip codes and killing.
And that already is a revolutionary thought, right? That, like, what if it's not a the reason why the revolution isn't televised is because it's internal, right? And in terms of the setting, and container, and I know you talk a lot about being embodied and being returned to the body, right? As part of what I mean, it happens for a lot of people in healing trauma, but something unique about I mean, and maybe this is like, what's unique about the Black psychedelic revolution in terms of setting, and container? How do we co-create that? Because that's definitely been a question about how do we support um, BIPOC communities,
Mhm.
given that we do not have sufficient numbers of facilitators who identify as such. And there's also the cultural and the mask. You talk a lot about the masks in the book, and the masks that we put on. And I love the Black Panther conversation, and I'm sorry for listeners who aren't getting the full context with the about the book. So I'll just teach you guys. You guys just have to read it, okay? Just get the I'll be a pusher.
Please push it.
I know, right?
This sounds great.
No, really, I'm like, "That's it," yeah, I will confess, like, I'm like, "Okay, maybe I need a book club so that we can have because like, even in terms of the idea of your book being a trip, because you do talk about that, right? This is a trip, or, like, and it even has this sort of idealization, envisioning of what could be the revolution in terms of a setting, like, the what was it, Tanisha, who comes into
Yeah.
the center, and at first she's not ready, right? And she's still
Mhm.
very much in um, a
Yep.
a
Yep.
sort of a drug user sort of,
Mhm.
mindset, and then you're like, "Come back when you're ready," and then when she comes back, she's welcomed with warm, inviting arms, with no judgment, with real
Mhm.
compassion, and gets the shot of ketamine, and, we experience part of that, what that healing trip would be like.
Yeah. Yeah. I
But
think that's probably for part 2, but
yeah, what
yeah.
part of the I know we have only but what could you say? Like, if someone can only hear one thing, one takeaway from this, the 5 minute, what's the 2 minute blip that we get to share with people? What would that be?
Loving others is the real trip. Psychedelics is a door that opens up between where you're at now and who you really wanna be. And who you really wanna be when you look through the door, and it's kind of like a bit of a tunnel, and there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and that light is you in communion with others. That's really what psychedelics offer. There's different doors to get there. Psychedelics is just one door. It's a very powerful door, and it's so powerful that we've seen it over centuries, across cultures, across continents. It's always reappeared. But that now, as the walls are getting rebuilt between people, and us versus them, and we're getting trapped in our tribes, trapped in our labels, trapped in our bodies, that psychedelics is a door. And when you look through it, you're going to see that there's more to you. And the greatest effort is to take responsibility for how much more of you there is.
Something I ask a lot of people when they come onto the show,
Mhm.
people who are coming new to this space and experience, what kind of sourcing, what kind of resourcing do you feel people need? And that can be, whether that's like, what would you recommend for someone? Whether it's, what's good for within themselves. I know you mentioned in your book about setting and container, and a little bit more emphasis, I would actually even argue, on container. But what would you tell someone in terms of what helps to source themselves? What kind of recommendations would you give someone who is considering, their own experience?
If hmm, psychedelics it's a bit like being shot out of a cannon, and you have to ask, where do you want to aim your psychedelic experience at? Because there's definitely value in a very bodily psychedelic experience where you take, maybe MDMA and go to a deep house club and sweat it out all night long. There's value in taking a microdose of LSD and getting in front of a blank canvas and painting oils on it, when seeing what visions emerge through your unconscious out of your fingertips. There's definitely a value in having, say, you're going through a separation, a divorce, or your children are leaving the house because, they're going off into the world, where their college or career or on their own explorations. If you're in that kind of therapeutic space, one thing I found is surrounding yourself by pictures, or sometimes I actually, after my mom passed, I had a really, really beautiful ketamine therapy treatment, and I brought her photos, and I brought my son's like socks and family photos that went back from my grandmother to True, to my son. And what I found is that having those anchors, whether it's photos or even just the smell of a child on a sock, that they intensify the therapeutic part of the trip. And so I would just tell people that you can design your own psychedelic experience, but there are some basic principles um, that are the architecture of a psychedelic trip, and you have to kind of know how different types of architecture will either enhance or diminish different types of trips. So if you're going to do the club, great, but have someone who's a designated driver and someone who's a spotter to make sure that you don't get taken advantage of. If you're going to do an artistic trip, maybe find inspiration in the art that you've um, that you learned over the years, or that was your mentor. um, or challenge yourself. Or if you're going to do a therapeutic trip, have anchors, you know? And one thing I found is when I was going through my own separation and then also healing from my mom's passing, that having a therapy session right before the the ketamine trip was incredibly helpful because it puts you really right in the zone, and then you're off and running. And then I
In
would say,
terms of your mindset, to help create the
yeah,
mindset before the
yeah,
experience. Yeah.
yeah, to create the setting. And I say that afterwards, the container is the integration, right? How do you integrate that into your? Because the thing is that the psychedelics, at least my experience, is that they increase my consciousness. And so beyond the bandwidth of my kind of ego consciousness, they increased both to my subconsciousness, but also to what I know about others that I refuse to take responsibility for. The way that their facial expressions, their pheromones, their tones of voice, their body language, and how much more of other people that I actually really do know, but I refused to be conscious of because that would be too much emotional responsibility. And so, as my bandwidth increased, I knew how much more deep my knowledge was of the people in my life, but also how much subconscious and unconscious, and it just got larger and larger. And then finally, it started to get into the radiant consciousness, where I began to see how small a part of what I was with larger life, with the flow of life itself. And then, as obviously the chemicals wear off, and my consciousness starts to go back to its original bandwidth, but it's never going to be the same size again. And how do I integrate that enlargement now as part of my life, and able to make actual decisions, courses of action, different types of language, um, maybe changing my political or artistic ideologies to take into account what I've experienced on that journey. And I think that's really that container is really, really important to be able to integrate.
No, I love that. I love everything from the anchor points you mentioned for therapeutic to talking about integration and how we've actually expanded and we need to adjust to that shift. That altered state that isn't just the experience itself. It goes beyond that, right? And when you think about how do you want people to take and integrate the trip of the Black Psychedelic Revolution book?
To It's gonna different class levels and different different series of symptoms and pathologies are going to require maybe slightly different containers. What we're doing, there's like a small little team that's interested in kind of taking this um, beyond the book and making events and starting to organize and promoting. And the first thing we'll do is use narrative therapy to help people recognize what are the conflicts in their life and what are the conflicts they have with each other, and then begin to actually use William E. Cross's Negro to Black conversion experience as a kind of a container and begin to ask how has internalized racism or the history of systemic trauma shaped their lives. And once they're aware of that, then ask, okay, in a psychedelic trip, be able to expand one's consciousness to understand the deeper levels of one's own memories, one's own um, trauma, and the defensive behaviors. So it's almost like trauma is a pearl, and all the defensive behaviors kind of create a kind of this shell around it to protect us from having to deal with it. And so we will do workshops, at different, places that host us. During the spring and summer, we'll host outside events. And then the goal is for it to become like a meme or like a cultural practice that travels beyond our core group, which is just really almost like a presentation group. And that as it travels through the communities, as it travels through the buildings and the homes and the families and the relatives and the network of friends from Section 8 all the way to Queens, the Hamptons and the Far Rockaways, as it spreads, people start doing it not because they're paying for it, but they do it the same way that some people go to church. Like it just becomes something that's part of a culture. Like this helps me. This actually gets my life moving again. So some of the containers would be using meditation exercises and breath work exercise, like a heartbeat meditation, listening to a heartbeat and asking what, writing, narrative therapy, writing, what does your body, if your body could write you a letter, what would it say to you? You know? If your ancestors were alive, what would they say to you? So like just trying to use the expanded consciousness of psychedelics to put you back into the place of your body, back into the place of your ancestors, into the place of your descendants, into the place of people around you. And by decentering yourself, then you come back, you get this larger kind of map of why you are who you are and how you really relate to those around you. So I think that would be it. And I think eventually the container of the Negro to Black conversion experience, which came out in 1971, that's William Cross's kind of stage theory of Black identity formation, that what you see is that when people become more aware, then they inevitably share stories. And it's in the sharing of their stories that they realized that the plight I suffered is not an individual like happenstance, that this is something that all of us are sharing because it's part of a system. And the minute that you go from being an individual to being part of a collective that has organized around a shared story, and that shared story allows you and drives you to try to repair the damage and then also dismantle the system that's causing the damage. Now you're going from the personal to the political.
I
And
love
so,
that. Yeah. Oh, sorry. You can
no,
complete
no,
the
go
thought.
ahead, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, like, for me, that really illustrates, right, that the personal narrative that you're telling yourself and the relationship you have with these stories, and 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 literally sort of like a breaking down to breakthrough type of idea where you're examining it critically, right? For healing, for transformation, for yourself, and then turning that into collective healing and collective change and storytelling that um, people all the time in psychedelic space talk about like the journey, right? Or that the journey never ends or things like that, right? And if you think about in terms of our personal narrative of our lives, of our identities, of our traumas, of our collective experiences, or of trying to dream the dream that we want to live, right? That the ultimate creation or co-creation would be to dream the world we want to live in.
Yeah, yeah. And I think and maybe that's for me, the most powerful part of psychedelics is that once you visited that place and you talk to other people about that place, even if you're not on psychedelics at that moment, in the instant of the conversation in the present tense, that you know what it was like. And it's an experience that is not just ethereal. It's not just like a mental experience. It's your whole body. You felt it. And I think that allows for the foundation of good faith. We've all been there. We've all experienced that sense of interconnectedness with everything and how that felt so much closer to reality than this kind of small little like bandwidth that our ego allows. And I think that's what makes the psychedelic revolution for me seem a very unique possibility in history because it's a revolution that's based on interconnectedness, the reality of it, that we have empathy for each other. That in the psychedelic experience, because the emotions are so intense and so oceanic waves, they wash you up and down. It's like throwing a one of those Greek theater, sad, happy theater mask and throwing it out into an ocean storm. Um, that you really get to the primal core of what it means to be a human animal that's conscious for a brief crack of conscious light in the brain after birth and then death. And so you have this brief, human experience and it's like a lightning. The psychedelic is like this lightning strike that connects the most primal part of being a human animal with our most transcendent consciousness. And when you do that, so much gets illuminated. And if when the people talk, they can say like, yes, I know I've been to that place. And I think it allows for the political imagination to be rejuvenated, you know? And I think that's why for me, there's a possibility of a psychedelic revolution that's based on this shared euphoria that we've had and could be nonviolent. Like it could actually be more about art and creation and beauty. Um, and that's what I'm feeling. And it's also, I feel like the world is so hungry for it. Like we just seem so trapped right now, um, in these shadows and smoke and mirrors and traps and pits. And I just feel that the world is so hungry to feel human again.
Yeah. I think that's really beautiful and poetic in a way, even the trap. I'm not gonna glorify the trap per se, but even to envision that the recognition that there's a hunger, right? That's beyond the individual, that's collective, and that we're all living to varying degrees and to varying depths. Um of our own humanity, and that psychedelic experience helps to not just have elements of a shared experience, even if we're not together in it, that we can all integrate to create a different kind of revolution. Yeah, that's really freeing.
Mm. Oh, that feels good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what would be, what? So as we wrap up, what would be sort of like, I know you're a poet. I won't make you say a poem,
Yeah.
but but what's something that we can look to as a takeaway thought or message, to take with us, to if we're going to see the dream, you and I, in
Yeah.
this moment, and gift this little podcast episode to the world. What kind of seed can we
There's
spread?
this incredible poet. His name is Paul Celan, and he has I think the poem is titled "Speak You" also, and the very last stanza, and I'm paraphrasing, but the poem is about the idea that two individual people are so irredeemably different that they can't actually ever communicate to each other and say everything to each other. And as a poet, Paul Celan felt that idea that people are just always separated from each other because they can never put into words their full human existence, their full being, as missing out that so much of what we communicate to each other is actually we communicate it to each other outside of words and on the side of words, and sometimes inside words. But then sometimes, and so for him, he said, I think his idea was that emptiness communicates too. Like you can talk through emptiness. And he had this one beautiful stanza where he goes, I was there, I was not there. You were there, you weren't there. And when only the void stood between us, we got all the way to each other.
Wow.
Yeah. And I thought,
That's powerful.
right?
Yeah.
So just when you think that there's a wall between you or you and the world, or there's this emptiness that you can't cross, just remember that you also are the emptiness. And you can play the emptiness like a piano or a flute, and you can communicate. And sometimes you can say more through the emptiness than you could ever say through words.
Well, on that note, I will thank you for the non-emptiness and void of this conversation. Crossing a different chasm. Even though we've never met in person, I definitely feel a shared heart space with you,
Yeah.
and it's just been a beautiful experience. So thank you for your book. Thank you for your time, and I will see you connected in the void.
All right, sister. Talk to you soon.
I have to admit, I have so many takeaways from this conversation with Nick. It was such a joy and delight, and honestly, I always appreciate when I'm feeling inspired at the end of a conversation with someone, and this is definitely one of the examples where I would say that I myself am feeling even more inspired. The idea of, not just a Black psychedelic revolution, but a revolution for all of us in terms of the possibility of co-creating that possible future, that beyond an experience, beyond even healing, it's the revolution and transformation of our world that we can co-create together. So, action step for us all. I hope you find a little piece of inspiration and action for your own contribution to our heart revolution. Much love. Thank you for joining me on Psychedelic Source. If you found value in today's episode, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and share with others in our community. And if you're a psychedelic practitioner, therapist, or coach looking to identify blind spots in your practice or determine next steps for moving it forward, take the first step by visiting psychedelicsourcepodcast.com. Until next time, remember, start low, go slow, and stay connected to your source.